Hi, welcome to the Creating Global Understanding, World Languages and Cultures and University Museums exhibition that has been open, well now closed, at the Christian Petersen Art Museum since January. My name is Adrienne Gennett. I'm the Associate Curator of Collections and Education, and I'm here to talk a little bit more in depth about the story of Ganseliesel, the Goose Girl. That it includes all these objects in this case right here. So in this case, we have several different objects that all show the Goose Girl, Ganseliesel. But the object from University Museum's collection is this small little picture right here in the corner. This picture was made by Domfrère, a glass manufacturer located in Nancy, France. Nancy is located in the region of Lorraine, and Alsace-Lorraine was the entire area in this eastern part of France. And Alsace-Lorraine went back and forth between French and German rule for many years. And in 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, Germany took over most of Alsace and a bit of Lorraine. And so this caused a lot of issues as French people were being forced under German rule, of course. But it also caused a lot of transfer between cultures. Now, Nancy actually remained French at this time, and many French refugees fled to Nancy and I think tripled the population in the city in these 30 or so years until 1918 when it became French, the whole region became French again. And many were artists and artisans and makers who really helped build up Nancy's reputation for art and decorative arts. So Ganseliesel is the Goose Girl. And there are many different stories that have come around about her. Some of the original stories focus on how she was a beautiful princess that went off to marry a prince, and I believe her maid was with her and took over her identity and made the princess be the maid, and the maid became the princess and fooled the prince for a time, but after some time they figured it out, and the princess, of course, and the prince were in love and got married, and everything came out right. Many of the stories that you find were some of those taken by the Grimm brothers, who collected different folk tales from cultures around the world and compiled them into a book. And a lot of these have kind of cautionary moments in them and some violence to talk about things that should or should not happen, and how we as different cultures teach children and other young adults how to be cautious and to understand the world in different ways and to protect themselves. And so that original story has a little bit of violence in it, but we today want to focus a little more on the idea of true love wins, right? That fairy tale image of the Goose Girl. So these different objects depict Ganseliesel with her goose. You don't see a prince or a princess in general. She's got this headpiece you see in most of these objects. The big kind of bow headpiece, that is a very traditional Alsatian headpiece. And so it can look a little confusing if you're not used to it, but it's very much a traditional style of costume in that heritage. And so you see her from back on the little picture with her geese. This is from the 1960s, this little bronze statuette where she again has her geese that I believe she is feeding at the moment. And then we have a little Dutch oven that Dr. Schaal received when she got married as a gift. So the idea that this Goose Girl has now come to symbolize different aspects of love and life that you would give it at a wedding. The three books in this case also talk about Ganseliesel, the Goose Girl, but in very different ways. The pale blue book in the opposite corner there was created by an illustrator named Hansi in the early 20th century, and he used the character to really depict Alsatian pride and the pride of Alsatians at that point that they were French and not German. And so the story itself has some focuses on that aspect of the going back and forth between being German and French and how he wanted to exert that he was a French person. And in the middle, the book there is a German version. I won't try to butcher the title for you, but you see Ganseliesel on the cover walking along. But that entire story is told in German. And on the other far end here, the darker blue book is Le Bretzel de Lisette. So her name has changed a little bit. It's not Ganseliesel, And she is talking about how pretzels are French and not German, but they were created in France, supposedly. And it actually has nothing to do with the original story. Pretzels are not part of the original story, and the goose you see on the cover, but the goose makes no other appearance in the entire book. So now we're taking this figure who has become revered in both French and German cultures and seen in statues and water fountains throughout both regions, areas, and being used just as this image of a girl that is everyone knows and has grown up with and is comfortable, but taking away that original intent and the original understanding of who she was and her fairy tale story. So why did we include our one object from the University Museum's permanent collection and all these lovely loaned objects from Dr. Schaal in this exhibition? This exhibition, Creating Global Understanding, was a moment to talk about the diversity in the University Museum's permanent collection, but how that diversity is also very much about human nature and how throughout culture and throughout time, we have objects that are thousands of years old in this exhibition to objects made just 100 years ago or just a few years ago, talking about how art is made by every culture and how that art speaks about a moment in time, these people, these places, what's important to them, what they value, and what they care about and love and find beautiful. And how those continue and get passed along and change, and how other cultures can adapt and use those same ideas and images and motifs. And here's a great example where this girl is being used in two cultures that are very close together, of course, but how though the girl has passed over those borders really easily, and both the Germans and French have taken her on as their own and created their own stories around her and put her in their culture as a figure that is important to them. And so she transcends a culture, right? And you can think about fairy tales that we hear, or how Disney has changed those fairy tales and created them so that they're pertinent to what we are interested in today as a culture. Those original stories were a lot of these stories like the Grimm brothers' tales that were a little more cautionary, and how we've taken them and made them into these figures that talk about society or culture and what's important to us, and how we can teach the values of what we believe in as a culture to children and help them understand the world around them. So unfortunately, this exhibition won't probably be reopening due to the coronavirus at this time, but I'm glad I've had a chance to give you a couple of little glimpses into it, and especially this case, which means a lot to Dr. Michele Shaw and I, and it was one of the beginning objects that we knew would be in this exhibition, and we were going to build things around to talk about. This little picture is something that I also love, and if you ever want to see it again, it will probably pop up in an exhibition over in the Brunier Art Museum someday. It's an important piece of French design and French glass, and I love to talk about glass, so it will probably appear one day. But if you're interested in any more information, you can go to our website, and you can also look up all of our objects in our collection if you're interested in finding other cultures and other objects from other cultures throughout our permanent collection.
Hello and bonjour everyone. My name is Michele Shaw, and I'm an associate professor of French and Women's and Gender Studies here at Iowa State University. Together with Adrienne Gennett from the ISU Museums, I am the co-curator of the exhibit Creating Global Understanding. Unfortunately, you cannot come and visit the exhibit, so we decided to bring it to you. And more specifically today, I'm going to talk about the window that is behind me and that features objects from my home state in France, Alsace. Some of these objects belong to me, but the picture right there, right behind me, belongs to the ISU Museums and features one of the most beloved characters in Alsace. Her name is Consolise, or in English, that would be the Goose Girl. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about her story and also the meaning of the different objects in quote-unquote my window. If you ever travel to Alsace, people would talk to you about Ganselise, but if you asked about her origins or who the Goose Girl is, most people would tell you that they don't know, that she's always just been there and that she is a symbol of that state or region, as it is called in France. I myself grew around her because she has been featured since at least the 19th century, if not before, on a variety of objects. So for instance, if you travel to Alsace yourselves, you would find her on keychains, on mugs, on t-shirts, in a variety of publications. So I would say that in my home state in France, everybody's familiar with her, but you just don't know her necessarily her origins. But you do know that she is from Alsace and that she stands for Alsace, or is one of the many symbols for Alsace. The other ones being, as you can see in the window, the pretzel, because no, the pretzel is not German, it's Alsatian, it's French. And the other one would be the stork. And there are other symbols, but these are the most and the best known ones, including the Goose Girl or Ganzenliesel. Ganzenliesel or Goose Girl is indeed part of both Alsatian and German folklore, especially at the border. How they differ is, I mean, there are many ways in which they are similar and different. Most of the time, she is featured as a very young girl, typically under 10, or a young woman, a teenage girl, so 14, 15, 16. Sometimes she may be depicted in both cultures as a younger woman, so in her early 20s, but typically she is depicted as a girl in both cultures. How she differs from one culture to the next is actually what she represents. So I cannot speak for Germany, but for Alsace for sure, she became to stand for also the French identity of Alsace. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the history of that state of Alsace, it changed nationalities 5 times in just 200 years. So starting in the 18th century, moving on from being French to being German to being French again. And Alsace has been part again of France since 1918 at the end of World War I. In 1871, especially, France lost a war to Prussia, and this is when both the regions or states of Alsace and Lorraine belonged to Germany. But for many people, especially in Alsace, this was traumatic because they really felt and identified as French, so they didn't recognize themselves with that within that new geographical and national landscape. So this is why many migrated either to France or even to the USA, because there is a large population, Alsatian population actually here in Iowa. It's always been very interesting how, you know, when people ask me what part of France are you from, and I said, oh, I'm from Alsace, Iowans have always told me, oh, my ancestors came from Alsace too. So we are living in a small world indeed, and the name of this exhibit, Creating Global Understanding, makes very much sense because, you know, we may be here in Iowa, but we have ties to France, obviously, and to Alsace. But to go back to the significance of Ganzenliesel in France, and especially in Alsace, I would like to talk about one of the books that's behind me, and it would be this one right there. That's called Mon Village, Ceux qui n'oublient pas, or My Village, My Hometown, Those Who Do Not Forget. And it was written and illustrated by a very famous Alsatian illustrator and storyteller, Hansi. His name is right there, Hansi. And many of his illustrations are from that particular book are still used today. Like you have, for instance, here, this Dutch oven that was actually a wedding gift to us when my husband and I got married. So this book, Mon Village, or My Hometown, was a way for Hansi to show how he felt French and that Alsace should become French again. It doesn't show so much on the cover, but many of the Alsatian girls and boys, and also characters that are featured in this particular story and book, bear the French flag in one way or another. So it can be either on the headset that the girl is wearing on the cover, right there. So blue, white, and red, or carrying flowers or any other items that have those colors. And that was far more controversial than one might think today, because precisely at that time, Alsace was not French. So putting the French flag on Alsatian characters was a way to reclaim that nationality, even if at that time it was no longer the case. The issue with that book today is that it is very anti-German, and so it makes one very, very uncomfortable. I mean, as a 21st century and 20th century or post-World War II person, because it's hard to understand that sentiment. But again, back at that time, a different nationality, a different culture was forced on many people. And just like Hensi, they resented that. This is why, as I mentioned, they migrated either to France or elsewhere, or they tried to resist from Alsace itself. So in Alsace, she definitely stands for Alsatian identity, but especially for French Alsatian identity, especially when the state, the region, was no longer French. There is no actual difference between the French and the German version of the Goose Girl story, at least the written one, because the one that is readily available is actually the story that was recorded by the Grimm brothers in Germany in the 19th century. So most French people would read, if they read any of the texts, the Grimm brothers version, La Gardeuse d'Oie, or La Petite Gardeuse d'Oie, that is to say, the little goose girl or goose keeper. Now, if you do look at scholarship on that particular tale, even if the one that is readily available in any language is the translation of the Grimm brothers recordings, but they do underline, scholarship underlines that there are many common features across the globe. So this is not a story that is unique to Germany or France or Europe for that matter. It is a global one. So it really fits nicely the theme of the exhibit, creating global understanding. Now, is it necessarily a Goose Girl? Is it necessarily the way the story is, or the one similar to the one recorded by the Grimm brothers? That I cannot tell you because I don't know all of the versions. But just like Cinderella, it more or less, it probably also features the main character who is from the aristocracy, or what the equivalent of the aristocracy in any given culture, that has to go through a particular trial, a particular ordeal to finally regain his or her or their position within society and even within their gender identity. Because scholarship also says that, most fairy tales, there is a sort of disorder happening at the beginning and order is restored at the end, regardless of what that order is. That doesn't mean that some of the fairy tales cannot have a little bit more of a rebellious side. This is what's wonderful about fairy and folk tales, is that even centuries, millennia after they first emerged in human cultures, they still speak to us, but in different manners. So some people may interpret them as maybe a bit conservative, but other people can see them as rebellious. So it is really what you are going to make to them. And this is how art works, actually. Art tells more about you as an individual, as a community, as a nation even, than the artwork itself. And that's the beauty of art, like I said, and why I love it so much, and why I've included the museum in all of the classes I teach. But to go back to Goose Girl, there are apparently, according to scholarship, also a written version that emerged before the Grimm brothers in roughly the 16th and 17th centuries in France and in Italy. Now in France, what I can tell you is that indeed in the 17th century especially, there were a lot of women writers who provided fairy tales, or what we call today fairy tales. That's the difference between, the admitted difference between folk and fairy tales. Folk are usually the oral stories, the unrecorded ones, or recorded later, and the fairy tales are really literary artworks. So there is a real work on how that text will be crafted and later on told. And in the 17th century, a lot of women, as I said, in France, like for instance, Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy, had salons. So these were weekly meetings where artists, philosophers, theologians gathered and exchanged ideas about a variety of subjects. And during those salons, les conteuses, told their own stories. But there were more than just stories, because these women were intellectuals. They were interested in the arts and whatever political events were happening at that time. So some scholars have underlined, for instance, that many of these conteuses or women storytellers from the aristocracy attended dissections at the time, were interested in medicine. So some of the fairy tales actually talk about, without necessarily us understanding it, what was known about the human body, and especially the human reproductive functions in those fairy tales, using analogies with nuts and eggs. So that's really fascinating. So for us, it sounds like a fairy tale, you know, with animals, with objects that talk and so on and so forth. But there is more to them than what we think. Now, another very famous storyteller and whose tales you are most familiar with is Schaal and his anthology that was called The Tales of Mother Goose. Now, even if the title bears the name of Mother Goose, there is no story about Ganseliesel or the Goose Girl in that particular anthology, to my recollection. It's just the name that was given to the anthology. And you are familiar with The Tales of Mother Goose by Schaal because Walt Disney, for all his princess films, the early princess films were based on those particular tales and not the Grimm brothers. The most obvious reason why is probably because the Grimm brothers, their tales tend to be very, very violent, very bloody. This is not the case of the French versions by Schaal that again, as I mentioned, emerged in the 17th century. So if there were any differences between French and German tellings of the Goose Girl, if one existed, I would say that the difference would probably be the level of violence. But again, that is to be found out if somebody is familiar with one of the French or other European, like for instance, Italian versions. Use the discussion feed and share your thoughts about that. When these folk tales emerged and then when they were made into fairy tales, that is to say, when they transitioned from an oral tradition to a written text, there had many, I mean, when they started, they were meant for communities and they reflected, you know, more a communal identity, even if it was reflected through the actions or the adventures of an individual. So for today, for us 20th and 21st century people, yes, it is about personal identity. But when they started, they were more about, you know, a communal identity. So like I mentioned before, it can be interpreted in many different ways. And this is why they're still popular and so strong still today. And that's the beauty of art and especially storytelling, as I mentioned before. So for Goose Girl, yes, for today, you could say that it's about, you know, this young girl who learns that she has to fend up for herself and stand up for herself to a certain extent in order for justice to be restored. Actually, according to Bruno Bettelheim, who was a psychoanalyst and who used psychoanalysis to interpret fairy tales. Actually, many of the early 20th century interpretations or early to mid 20th century interpretations of fairy tales happened through psychoanalysis. There were many books published through that perspective, but not only. For instance, Vladimir Pop in Russia and the Russian formalists also looked at those fairy tales from the perspective of form, literally what they were made of, the characters, the types, and also how the stories unfolded. But what Bruno Bettelheim, to go back to him, said is that it was a way to gain autonomy and teaching children how to gain autonomy. So yes, in that particular way, it could be related to personal identity. But it was also about communal identity because this was a time when those stories emerged. It's hard to exactly date them, but when those stories emerged, there was no Netflix, there was no radio, there was no TV. That was the only form of entertainment, and therefore also the only way to teach a lesson, and not just to children, actually, like it is often believed. Those tales were for everyone, for entertainment, but also to learn a lesson. So there could be many lessons learned from that particular tale. That is to say, you should never lie about yourself or you'll be punished if you lie. This is what happens to the servant at the end. But also that you need indeed to stand up for yourself and that you need to stay true to yourself and to actually values, so communal values also, which is what the Goose Girl does. One aspect that speaks particularly to me, it's difficult to say for the Grimm tale, because again, I am most familiar with, you know, the symbolism of the character from my home state of Alsace. So I would say it's not that the story doesn't speak to me at all, but since I'm more familiar with the symbolism, I would say that what speaks to me more is again this connection to Alsace, that the character itself is. there is often a misconception that tales and fairy tales, especially the written kind, are meant for children only. As I mentioned, in the 16th century France, oh no, sorry, 17th century France, the conteuses, the women storytellers, wrote those tales for peers, so their own kind, aristocrats, intellectuals, and so on and so forth. So they were not meant for children initially. Same thing for actually the tales that I mentioned that inspired the Walt Disney movies, Charles Perrault's Tales of Mother Goose, or Mother Goose Tales. They were initially not meant for peers. It is only later on that fairy tales and folk tales have been perceived as meant for children only. This may be attributed, and some scholars have talked about it, to the fact that the Brothers Grimm's anthology of the stories they collected is titled as Kinder- und Hausmärchen, that is to say in English, children and household tales. So since the title starts with children, many people thought that it was meant for children only. But again, if you listen to the full title or pay attention to the full title of the Grimm Brothers anthology, it is meant for both children and the household. So in the end, everyone. Because as I mentioned, no Netflix, no Hulu, no whatever else exists, other streaming platforms for music or any kind of entertainment, YouTube, like we're going to use here, since no radio, no TV, no nothing. This was the only way to entertain, and as you mentioned though in your question, as a way to pass on lessons. But again, not just for children, because in the end, if you think about it, a lot of, like I mentioned also previously, this idea of, there is some kind of disorder happening and order is restored in the end. So pay attention to what you do. Every kind of action you do, it has consequences, whether positive or negative ones. Is that only a lesson for children? Isn't that applicable to all people? And this is really what is at the heart of many, at least of the European stories. But you will find this idea of, whatever you do, there are consequences. You find that idea across cultures. It is true that the Goose Girl, as I mentioned also before, the German version, but like many of the Grimm brothers' tales, the ones they recorded are very, very violent. And scholars have also established the fact that the Grimm brothers did perform some kind of censorship. They did especially so when some of the tales challenged conventional gender roles, or if, yes, indeed, they were perceived as too brutal. And some have completely disappeared from anthologies. For instance, Bluebeard Tale, so about this Bluebeard, the main character who has had several wives, and the last one actually discovers that he had killed all of the previous ones. Today's scholars, and especially feminist scholars, interpret this tale as an early illustration of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So that one, because it is brutal, both the French and the German version, even if the German version is a bit bloodier, have no longer been included in most of the anthologies meant for children, precisely because of the brutality. So yes, you could always retell the Goose Girl with less brutal aspects, but at the same time, you would lose part of what makes the story so significant. So it is not an easy choice to make. And many people, and pedagogists especially, have debated, should some of the more violent aspects be kept in anthologies that are meant especially for children, or should they be removed? I don't have an answer for that. I think in the end it is an individual's choice as a parent too, of what kind of stories you want to provide your children with. And of course there is also this aspect of being age appropriate. This is not something that applied, as I mentioned in the past, because everyone was told the stories regardless of age. But today, as I mentioned also before, things are different. So of course we have to take different consideration into account when deciding to read or give the stories to children of a certain age or not, of course. So we are now going back to my case, which features many of my objects and one from the ISU museums. So the ISU museums has that picture right there with Gonzaliso, or the Goose Girl, featured on it. Now, a little bit of a background story. So as I mentioned previously, I have included the museum in all of my classes since I started as an assistant professor here at Iowa State University in 2012. And it has either included a visit to the museum or the museum coming to my classes, students writing a paper about the objects they saw, or performing a presentation at the museum itself. So for instance, for one of my French classes, the final exam is called Le Musée est à moi, or the museum is mine. And people from the ISU museums, either Lila Anderson or Adrienne Gennett, come to my classes, show a PowerPoint of the French art objects that the museum owns, and then the students in groups of 3 to 4 choose one object, and on the day of the final exam, the ISU Museums is very gracious and sets up a mini exhibit for us with the objects on site, and my students act as museum guides to their peers, to their classmates. And it's been a very, very successful and great assignment. A great assignment. The students have loved it very much. And of course, I've also attended many of the museum events. And back in 2015, in addition to one of their temporary exhibits, they also featured, as they always do, some items from their permanent ceramics collection or glass collections. And they featured the picture. And when I looked at it, all of a sudden I said to my husband, hey, look at this, it's Ganselise from a home state, from Alsace, unbelievable. And we started, talking with Adrienne and Lynette Pullman, the ISU Museum director, about, the object, how it came into the collection. So it was, of course, the Berniers who had acquired it and then brought it back and donated it to the museum. And actually, if you go to the website and you look at the tag for it, it says Headless Girl, because the person who did the inventory didn't know that the character was Ganselise or the Goose Girl, and that it is not a set of shoulders or a headless person, but it's actually the character is featured from the back, and what you see is actually the headset that is typical of the Alsatian traditional costume. So as you can see on the book there, so the headset, the apron, and also the white shirt, and many other items that I cannot discuss here. And you also have it again in that more recent book, the headset, the apron, and so on and so forth. And you can see it in all the objects here, and again on the statue, and also on the car sticker that I'm going to talk about a bit more in just a minute. So yes, it was absolutely fantastic to see, something from my home region featured in the museum. So of course it was quote unquote almost natural for me to have it featured in the creating global understanding exhibit, and for me, of course, to talk about. And when I talked to my mom about it, she went overboard and actually bought some more stuff, some of it too tacky for me to include, because as I mentioned, it is such a symbol of the region of Alsace that you can find Ganselise everywhere. I mentioned the Dutch oven previously that was granted to us as a wedding gift. It's right there. But my mother sent me this car sticker that says actually baby on board, or Meitele on board. Meitele means little girl in Alsatian. Alsatian is a German-based dialect. And she also sent out this Christmas ornament here that features a pretzel. So again, the other symbol for Alsace, but also Ganselise, so the Goose Girl, so the girl and her geese. And I also have this particular object, is a bronze statue that belongs to my family and now to me. My grandparents bought it in the 1950s when they did some tourism in the region itself. And finally, this book right there was granted by my godmother to my daughter as a gift. And the character is not called Ganselise. So Ganselise also means Lisbeth of the geese, or Elizabeth of the geese. So this character is not necessarily named, and all of the, avatars of Ganselise or the Goose Girl are not necessarily named Elizabeth in the, whether in Alsace or in Germany. But the story is inspired by her, or features a character that is oddly similar to the original character. So for example, here Les bretzels d'Alicette. So it says Alicettes pretzel. So the main character is called Alicette. So a sort of nickname that is close to Alice or Allison, for example. And she is actually a very mischievous little girl and is always accompanied by a goose that is actually nameless, but there on every single picture. And she helps Alicette when she has to come up with a recipe for pretzels. So as I mentioned, pretzels are not German, but actually French. So this is also something that you learned from this particular video for the ISU museums. And all of these objects are very interesting and dear to me, of course. Oh, and behind me is also a satirical cartoon or comic strip that was published in the 1990s, and where Gonseliesel, so the Goose Girl, or Elizabeth of the Geese, is used as a way to talk about the political state of Alsace in that particular era, so the 1990s. And what is also interesting is that when I, started investigating this particular character, because, as I mentioned, I've always been familiar with her. She's everywhere. If you go to Alsace, you'll see her everywhere. In shops, as items, as I mentioned, on mugs, t-shirts, you name it. But when investigating the character, there was oddly very little available, except, for the Grimm's brothers' Goose Girl tale. But I wouldn't go as far as to say it has nothing to do with the Alsatian symbol or Alsatian character, but they are, to a certain extent, very much different. So I even called one of the local bookshops in Strasbourg, that's the capital city of Alsace, my home state in France, and that library specializes in Alsatian fiction, non-fiction, and folklore. And they were unable to let me know of a resource that would tell the story specifically of the Alsatian Gonseliesel, even though, as I mentioned, she can be seen everywhere. So that was very interesting to see that the character is so prominent, yet very little is known about her. If you investigate a little bit, some of the story is just like the one in the Goose Girl by the brothers Grimm. And that is to say, a princess in disguise to avoid harm, or the other one that is punished for having done harm and is quote unquote downgraded from being a princess to a goose keeper. But again, there is no real final or definite story about the Alsatian Goose Girl. What was also interesting is that Beth Marden, my colleague in German, who's a teaching professor in German, was also familiar with the character and had also apparently many objects, but that she granted to her children and grandchildren. And so she was very familiar, but with the German aspect of that particular character. So we had many, many interesting discussions about both the Alsatian specificities and the German ones. And like I said, the Alsatian one would be, it's tied to a national symbol, or underlining that Alsace is a French state and not a German one. And also Gonseliesel in Germany, again, is mostly represented as a very young child, which in Alsace is different. She tends to be a young girl, a teenager, or maybe a young woman, but not that often a child. And this is something that you can see, for instance, in here, the satirical one, or in this the bronze statue here, or the book as well, or a teenage girl. But there are also, of course, exceptions because, obviously the car sticker that I mentioned does feature a young girl, and it's the same for the book here. And it's difficult to see it, but the Christmas ornament, it's more of a teenage girl. And yes, so these objects are very personal, and it was great to see them, how they connected to the museum object, that is to say, the picture. Now, fairy and folk tales can be very useful because if we take, for instance, the example of Gonseliesel or the Goose Girl, is that, as I mentioned, she is a very popular character as a symbol, both in France and in Germany. And if you ask the question, but who does she really belong to? Is she French? Is she German? And the question would be, she is both, and she belongs to neither one of them at the same time. Because many of these tales, as I also mentioned for the version that the brothers Grimm collected back in 19th century Germany, I mean, many of the motifs, many of the recurring, some of the recurring aspects have happened globally and for a very, very long time. So fairy tales are to a certain extent, or these tales, folk tales, fairy tales are to a certain extent, just like Gonsalise, borderless. They don't belong to any given culture, and at the same time, they belong to all. And this is what, is the purpose of creating global understanding. Yes, there are cultural specificities, and it is important to acknowledge and respect them. At the same time, though, when you look at art, and that includes folk and fairy tales, you see that there are also a lot of commonalities. So for instance, across the globe, the notions of, for instance, family, love, friendship, they may differ, and they have most certainly have, cultural specificities, but they belong. They are there in all global cultures. So again, like I mentioned, it is important to respect all differences. And at the same time, it's also interesting to see the many commonalities that we have despite all the differences. So folk and fairy tales are one way that we can connect the differences and the similarities. And generally speaking, art, and that again includes folk and fairy tales, is a bridge between cultures and people. As I've mentioned to my students or other museum events connected to creating global understanding, I don't want to paint a brighter picture of what art is. I mean, unfortunately, to this day, there is art that is fascist, racist, transphobic, and so on and so forth that is being produced. But at least art has that potential to connect, to bridge, as I mentioned, people and cultures. And again, fairy tales, and for instance, why not, Gonsalise or the Goose Girl has the power to do that as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little talk. As I said, it is very unfortunate that we cannot meet in person and that we cannot have this discussion in person. But I am looking forward to any comments, if you make any, in the discussion feed. And I am also looking forward to another collaboration with the museums in the future. And thank you for your time. And again, I hope you enjoyed it. Au revoir.